At 8:15 in the morning on August 7, 1942, a Navy pilot named James "Pug" Sutherland was barely staying alive in the sky above Guadalcanal. He sat in the cockpit of a Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a stubby, rugged fighter that carried much of the burden for the American fleet. But that morning, toughness was not enough. Ahead of him stretched a formation of Japanese bombers. Behind them, Zeros peeled downward, fast and deadly. Pug hauled the Wildcat into a hard turn, trying to bring the nose across the path of one bomber. When the sight picture looked right, he squeezed the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns in the wings came alive. Bright tracer rounds stitched across the sky. The bomber kept flying. No fire. No smoke. Nothing. Rounds slipped past the aircraft in every direction, some high, some low, others drifting left and right. It was like spraying water at a speeding car and hoping something might stick. The problem was not his aim. The problem was math, and it was getting American pilots killed every day. The word for it was convergence. To understand why so many enemy planes survived American gunfire in 1942, you had to look at where the guns were mounted. Nearly every Allied fighter, the Wildcat, the Mustang, the Corsair, the Spitfire, carried its guns in the wings. Not because that spot was ideal, but because there was nowhere else. The fuselage was already packed with engine, fuel, and pilot. The only strong structure left was the wing spars. That setup created a serious complication. The gun sat several feet out from the center line of the airplane, so they could not simply point straight ahead. If they did, the bullets would travel in two separate streams that never met, while the target, usually narrow, stayed right in the middle. So ground crews angled the guns inward. They adjusted them so the streams of fire would meet at a chosen distance, often around 300 yards. Picture two people standing 10 feet apart trying to poke the same spot with pool cues. Both sticks have to be aimed just right to meet in the middle. It works only if the target is exactly where you expect. In a dogfight, nothing stays where you expect. If a Japanese plane happened to be at that exact 300-yard mark, it flew straight into a concentrated storm of bullets. But at 200 yards, the streams had not crossed yet. Tracers would flash past on both sides of the cockpit, while the enemy remained untouched. At 400 yards, the streams had already crossed and spread out again, turning into a loose, useless pattern. This was the convergence trap. Pilots had to judge distance with near-perfect accuracy while pulling heavy G-forces and dodging incoming fire. Guess wrong, and all that shooting meant nothing. It got worse. Wings flex. They are not carved from stone. When a pilot hauled back on the stick in a high-speed pullout, the G-forces bent the wings upward. That movement twisted the gun mounts. A setup that was accurate on the ground could be several feet off in the air during a hard maneuver. American pilots often emptied thousands of rounds just to score a single victory, simply because their bullets refused to go where their eyes were looking. While Navy pilots swore at their wing-mounted guns, engineers at Lockheed in California were building a fighter that ignored the usual rules. It was called the P-38 Lightning. It did not resemble a normal fighter at all. It looked like something from a pulp science magazine. Instead of one fuselage, it had three. Two long booms held the engines, and a central pod carried the pilot. The aircraft was big, heavy, and strangely quiet. Its turbo superchargers muffled the exhaust, so enemies often did not hear it until it was already close. Pilots who saw it for the first time were unsure what to think. Some joked and called it the flying ladder. Others just called it odd. The Royal Air Force examined it, decided it was overly complicated, and canceled their order. In their view, a proper fighter had to be simple and nimble. The P-38 was neither. It was built for speed and high altitude, not tight turns. Yet the most controversial feature was not the twin tails or the hushed engines. It was the nose. The lead designer, Kelly Johnson, studied the convergence issue and concluded the whole system made no sense. He did not want pilots guessing distance. He did not want guns bending with the wings. He wanted his aircraft to fire like a rifle, not scatter like a shotgun. The unusual layout of the P-38 gave him an opportunity. With the engines mounted in the booms, the central nose section had open space. Johnson filled that space with weapons, placing the entire battery directly in front of the pilot. He did not settle for a light armament. He installed 4.50 caliber machine guns along with a powerful 20mm cannon. The barrels were grouped so closely they almost touched. Mechanics hated it. The compartment was so cramped that ammunition belts had to snake through a maze of chutes and guides. The cannon itself was formidable, firing high explosive shells nearly an inch across. Concentrating that much firepower in a space not much larger than a bathtub seemed excessive to many officers. Specialists in the Army Air Corps looked at the design and did not like what they saw. Many officers pushed back hard. They said most pilots were not sharpshooters and would never handle such a tight grouping of guns. Fire all those weapons at once, they warned, and the vibration alone would rattle the nose to pieces. In a real fight, they argued, a wide spread from wing guns helped cover small aiming errors. To them, a broad pattern of bullets was an advantage, like using a shotgun when birds burst from cover. A narrow stream demanded precision. Miss by a small margin, and you hit nothing at all. They labeled the Lightning's nose armament a specialist's tool, hinting that ordinary pilots would be useless with it. There was also concern about the cannon. The 20mm Hispano had a reputation for jamming. It was heavy, complex, and touchy. During early trials, it sometimes fired a short burst and then froze, leaving the pilot with only the machine guns. Critics seized on that as evidence the whole concept was overreaching. What they wanted was familiar equipment, simple, dependable guns in the wings. To them, the P-38 looked like an engineer's experiment that would fall apart once exposed to dirt, heat, and combat. Meanwhile, the fighting was already underway. Over the Pacific, the Japanese Zero was dominating the skies. It outperformed most Allied fighters in both speed and agility. It could reverse direction almost instantly. American pilots flying heavier P-40 fighters and Wildcats grew increasingly frustrated. They would dive on a Zero, get a fleeting firing chance, and then see their rounds flash past because the enemy was outside the narrow convergence zone. Seconds later, the Zero would roll and slide in behind them. What the Americans needed was not a tighter turn. They needed a machine that could strike hard in a single pass. They needed a killer that did not depend on dogfighting. When the first P-38 units reached the Pacific, their arrival brought both anticipation and anxiety. The cockpit felt different, almost like sitting in a car. There was a control wheel instead of a traditional stick. Side windows could be slid open. The aircraft was quiet, and just ahead of the pilot's feet, under a fabric cover on the nose, sat the weapon cluster. For heavy machine gun barrels and the dark opening of a cannon all pointed straight ahead. The pilots were unsure. Their training had emphasized spread patterns. They had learned to lead targets and blanket an area with fire. Now they were told to forget that habit. Their guns would send a compact stream of metal straight forward, not a widening spray. There would be no convergence point. At 50 yards, or 500, the rounds would land where the sight rested. On paper, it sounded promising, just as earlier theories had once sounded promising. But diagrams do not shoot back. As the first patrols lifted off from rough airstrips in New Guinea, tension ran high. They were flying a large, complicated aircraft against some of the most nimble fighters in existence. They knew the Lightning was fast and could climb well. What they did not know was whether that cramped, trembling nose section could truly destroy an enemy. They soon learned the doubters had been mistaken. When fire was concentrated instead of scattered, the effect was not just damage. It was destruction. While officials far from the front argued about aiming errors and bullet patterns, Lockheed's engineers understood they had changed the equation. The P-38's nose was more than a mounting point. It rejected the old way of thinking. In other fighters, a pilot had to juggle angles, closure rates, and bullet drop while his wings flexed under load. It was a chaotic calculation made worse by fear and motion. In the Lightning, much of that complexity vanished. By packing 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon into a space barely wider than a man's shoulders, Kelly Johnson had created something close to point-and-shoot combat. The underlying physics were brutally straightforward. In aircraft like the Spitfire or Wildcat, bullets left the wings, angled inward, met at roughly 300 yards, then spread again. The effective kill zone, where fire was dense enough to be decisive, was shallow. Fire too soon or too late, and the target slipped through untouched. The P-38 was different. Its guns fired nearly parallel streams. Those streams did not cross and did not fan out. They traveled together in a tight column, like a beam of light, all the way to the limits of their range. This single change altered air combat. A Lightning pilot could begin firing at 1,000 yards, a distance most other fighters could not use effectively, and still deliver a focused burst. He did not have to wait for a target to drift into a narrow sweet spot. Whether the zero was extremely close or far ahead, the principle stayed the same. Where the sight rested, the bullets went. Some pilots began calling it the finger of God. You pointed, and what you pointed at was finished. Accuracy alone was not the only factor. The concentration of fire was equally terrifying. The .50 caliber machine gun was already a fearsome weapon. Each round was thick and powerful, capable of smashing through engine parts or mangling a limb. Conventional fighters carried several of these guns spaced across the wings. Their hits were spread out. A burst might pepper a wing, punch a few holes in the fuselage, and maybe strike the cockpit. Scattered hits could cripple an aircraft, but they did not always finish it. A sturdy plane might soak up that kind of punishment and limp home. The Lightning's guns did not sprinkle damage. They concentrated it. All 4 machine guns and the cannon struck within an area no larger than a dinner plate. Pilots began calling the result the buzzsaw effect. When 5 heavy weapons smashed into the same patch of metal at the same moment, the airframe did not just get perforated, it came apart. Aluminum could not endure that kind of combined stress. The shock, vibration, and sheer energy shattered internal supports. It was the difference between tapping a window with gravel and smashing it with a sledgehammer. One chips, the other erases. At the center of this destructive power was the 20mm Hispano cannon. This was not a simple machine gun. It was closer to artillery mounted in an airplane. Each shell carried an explosive charge. When one struck a Japanese bomber, it did not merely pass through. It burst inside the structure. Officers had distrusted the cannon because it sometimes jammed, but ground crews in the Pacific learned how to keep it running. They lubricated it carefully, adjusted the feed system, and drilled pilots to fire in short, controlled bursts. When everything worked, the results were catastrophic. A single cannon hit could tear a wing off a fighter. Combined with the 4 machine guns, it gave the Lightning the ability to destroy an enemy in about a second of firing. Pilots soon understood they did not need to mix it up in tight turns. Trying to turn with a zero was still deadly. The zero was light and nimble. The P-38 was built for power and speed. Slow down a circle, and the Japanese fighter would be on you. So American pilots embraced a new approach known as boom and zoom. They used the Lightning's strong climb to get high above the enemy. From there, they pushed the nose down and dove. Weighing more than 15,000 pounds, the aircraft dropped like a heavy safe. It roared out of the clouds at speeds beyond 400 miles per hour. The pilot lined up a Japanese plane in the gun sight. He did not need to fuss over convergence or extreme lead angles. He simply placed the sight on the enemy and held the trigger for about 1 second. In that moment, the nose battery hurled roughly 60 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition along with several cannon shells. Because the guns fired in parallel, all of those projectiles struck nearly the same spot. The outcome was brutal. Wings tore free, tails snapped off, fuel tanks burst into fire. Japanese pilots who were used to American tracers flashing harmlessly around them were suddenly blown apart before they realized they were targeted. Before surviving Zeros could react, the Lightning used its speed to climb back up, out of reach. To the Japanese, it was baffling and frightening. They could not grasp how they were being hit from such distances. Earlier fights with Wildcats had been close and personal, almost like duels at knife range. Now aircraft were coming apart from shots fired far beyond what they thought possible. They began calling the P-38 the fork-tailed devil. The nickname fit not just its twin-boom shape, but the cold way it killed. It did not circle and spar. It struck and left. Still, mastering the buzzsaw took discipline. The weapon was powerful, but only if used correctly. Pilots had to break old habits. They could no longer spray the sky and hope something connected. With nose-mounted guns, you could not sweep a wide area like water from a hose. You had to aim with care. If your sight picture was off by a couple of feet, you missed entirely. The stream of bullets was so tight it could pass just under a wing without even scratching paint. It was a weapon of extremes. Either the target was destroyed at once, or nothing happened. Training changed to reflect that. Instructors told newcomers to think of the nose guns like a precision rifle. They advised holding fire until the enemy filled the sight. But experienced pilots realized they could take advantage of the accuracy at longer ranges. The concentrated fire let them engage bombers from beyond the effective reach of defensive guns. A Japanese Betty bomber carried a tail cannon, but it was inaccurate at long distance. A P-38 pilot could sit 800 yards behind it, safely outside serious return fire, and methodically knock out the engines one after another. The mental strain on Japanese bomber crews was severe. Earlier in the war, the G-4M Betty had ranged across the Pacific almost unchecked, using its speed and long reach to attack Allied ships. Now those bombers were coming apart in midair. Crews grew uneasy whenever they saw the twin-tail outline. They knew the Lightning did not just punch a few holes and cause slow leaks. It could slice an aircraft in two. As 1942 gave way to 1943, P-38 units began piling up victory totals that surprised many back home. Pilots once told that nose guns were cramped and unnecessary returned with gun camera footage that looked like scenes from a nightmare. Instead of smoke trails and scattered damage, the film showed aircraft being structurally destroyed. A bomber would fly steadily, and then in an instant, an entire wing would separate. The effect was violent, efficient, and shockingly effective. One battle over New Guinea sealed the reputation of the Lightning's nose battery. A group of P-38s intercepted Japanese transport aircraft guarded by Zeros. The Zeros tried to pull the Americans into a turning contest, the usual setup, but the Lightning pilots refused the invitation. They punched straight through the fighter cover and aimed for the transports instead. One of them, Lieutenant Sparks, picked out a transport and settled in behind it. The aircraft was large and slow, an easy shape to see in the gun sight. In a Wildcat, he would have needed several attack runs, raking the fuselage and hoping to damage something important while defensive gunners hammered back. In the P-38, Sparks simply squeezed and held the trigger. The nose battery thundered. A continuous stream of tracers seemed to link his aircraft to the base of the transport's wing, like a line of fire drawn between them. The wing did not just ignite. It came apart. Main spars, fuel lines, and metal skin were shredded as hundreds of rounds struck the same small area. The transport rolled, broke up, and plunged into the ocean. Sparks pulled into a climb, already searching for another target. He had used only a fraction of his ammunition. In that moment, he understood how wrong the critics had been. Concentrated fire was not excessive. In combat, there was no such thing as too much firepower. There was only shooting and reloading. The contest escalated from there. The Japanese tried adding armor to their bombers and worked on building faster fighters. Yet they never addressed the deeper issue in their design thinking. They still favored light, maneuverable aircraft meant for close duels. The Americans were fielding machines built to deliver overwhelming fire in a single pass. The P-38 embodied that idea completely. It was an airplane designed around its guns, built to deliver the greatest possible energy in the shortest possible time. On the ground, mechanics still grumbled about the cramped nose compartment. Replacing ammunition belts was awkward. Servicing the cannon was filthy, hard work that scraped knuckles. But their complaints about the concept faded. They saw the results when the aircraft returned. They watched pilots step out of missions that would likely have been fatal in other fighters. They also watched the rows of victory marks on the nose pods grow week by week. The buzzsaw kept feeding, and the Pacific offered no shortage of targets. Even so, a larger test loomed. The Lightning had proven it could tear apart bombers and slice through Zeros. But Japan was not about to yield control of the skies easily. Its most skilled aviators, the aces, were being sent forward to slow the American advance. At the same time, a new kind of American pilot was coming into his own. These men did more than just fly the aircraft. They had an instinctive feel for the geometry of the nose guns. Pilots such as Richard Bong and Tommy Maguire were about to turn the so-called flying ladder into one of the most lethal weapons in air combat history. They would demonstrate what happened when the equivalent of a precision rifle was mounted in a cockpit. On the morning of March 3, 1943, the theory behind the nose guns met a major Japanese naval operation over waters known as the Bismarck Sea. Japanese leaders had committed heavily to a large convoy. 8 troop transports, guarded by 8 destroyers and nearly 100 fighter aircraft, were heading toward New Guinea to reinforce failing positions. It was an army afloat. The Americans threw everything they could at it, with the 39th Fighter Squadron and P-38s forming the leading edge. Major George Pappy Gunn and the other leaders had drilled their tactics until they were automatic. They expected the Zeros to be circling high above the ships as top cover. In a fighter like the Wildcat, American pilots would have to climb to meet them, risking a swirling dogfight where the more agile Zeros held the advantage. The Lightning pilots chose a different approach. They stayed high, hidden by the sun, waiting for the right moment to apply the power of their nose-mounted guns. Around 10 in the morning, the cloud cover parted, revealing the Japanese convoy spread across the deep blue water like small models in a tub. Zeros cruised in relaxed patterns overhead, confident they could overwhelm any attacker that came near the transports. They did not notice the twin-tailed fighters diving from 20,000 feet. The P-38s plunged downward at more than 450 miles per hour, approaching the limits of their airframes. The Americans were not there to maneuver. They were there to strike. The opening moments of the fight stunned the Japanese pilots. A group of Zeros turned to intercept the diving aircraft, expecting the familiar turning battle, but the P-38s did not break into a circle. They held straight courses, committing to head-on attacks. Normally, such passes are tests of nerve, with two planes rushing toward each other and firing until one pilot veers away. For fighters with wing-mounted guns, Convergence makes this situation especially dangerous. Pilots must judge range exactly while closing at combined speeds nearing 800 miles per hour. Fire too soon, and the rounds pass wide. Fire too late, and a collision becomes likely. Lightning pilots did not face that dilemma. They relied on the same concentrated fire that had already proven itself. From about 1,000 yards, more than half a mile out, the Americans began shooting. 4.50 caliber machine guns and the 20mm cannon fired together. With no convergence to worry about, the projectiles flew in a tight, parallel stream. Japanese pilots, accustomed to seeing distant fire scatter harmlessly, suddenly found themselves flying directly into a dense wall of metal. The lead Zero did not merely ignite. It came apart. Explosive cannon shells slammed into the radial engine, blasting the cylinders to pieces. Heavy machine gun rounds tore through the windscreen and the pilot before he could even react. The fighter broke up in midair, scattering fragments of metal and burning oil. The P-38 flew straight through the debris, the pilot steady on course, his thumb still on the trigger. He had won a head-on duel before the opponent realized what was happening. With a gap torn in the fighter cover, the Lightnings kept diving toward the real objectives, the bombers and transports below. Japanese G-4M Betty bombers were flying low over the water to shield the ships. The Betty had speed and long range, but a serious weakness. Its fuel tanks were unprotected rubber cells in the wings. American airmen nicknamed them Flying Zippos because they burned so easily, though getting close enough to ignite them was usually risky. Lieutenant Richard Bong, a young pilot rapidly building a reputation, picked out one of the bombers. He was descending fast from behind. In another fighter, he would have had to worry about the bomber's tail gunner. A cannon mounted in the rear could be deadly if you lingered in line. Bong did not need to close in that far. From about 600 yards, safely beyond effective return fire, he placed his sight on the right wing root. He pressed the trigger for a single second. The nose of his Lightning shuddered as the concentrated fire struck. The stream of rounds seemed to link the two aircraft like a rigid rod. All four machine guns and the cannon hit the same small section of wing. The result was instant structural collapse. The main spar, the beam holding the wing to the fuselage, was effectively cut through by the sheer force of the impact. The bomber's right wing folded upward over the body. The aircraft snapped into a wild spin, spewing fuel and flame. A moment later it hit the sea, cartwheeling into an explosion. Bong pulled up, using the speed of his heavy fighter to climb sharply back into the sky. He had not just damaged the bomber. He had removed it from the fight in a single pass. With plenty of ammunition left, he searched for another target. The battle turned into a rout. The Japanese convoy was caught with little room to escape. The P-38s operated almost without opposition. They would dive, destroy a target with a precise burst, and then climb back to altitude. Japanese air cover was being dismantled piece by piece. The Japanese pilots fought hard, twisting and turning, trying to drag the Americans into close turning battles. The Americans refused. They fought in the vertical, relying on speed and altitude. Above all, They relied on the firepower in the Lightning's nose. One P-38 pilot ended up behind a Zero that was braking sharply left. In a P-40 or Wildcat, he would have had to aim well ahead, hoping the spread from his wing guns would intersect the enemy's path. With nose guns, he simply tracked the fighter. When the Zero's profile momentarily leveled as it reversed direction, he fired a short burst. The rounds hammered the fuselage. The tail section separated from the rest of the aircraft. The Zero tumbled away, leaving its pilot spinning in a cockpit no longer connected to a functioning tail. It was a stark display of raw energy. The Lightning was not just punching holes. It was ripping structures apart. By midday, Japanese fighters had largely vanished from the sky over the Bismarck Sea. Those that remained were fleeing. The P-38s then shifted their focus to the ships below. The transports, heavy in the water and crowded with troops, were easy targets. The Lightning was not designed primarily as a dive bomber, but its nose guns made it an exceptionally effective strafing aircraft. Pilots lined up on the vessels and came in low over the waves. They began firing from long range. 20mm shells punched through the relatively thin hulls. .50 caliber rounds swept across decks, tearing through wood and men alike. Water around the ships churned from the impacts. Fighters with wing-mounted guns were poorly suited to such attacks. Because their guns were spread wide, they had to fly directly at a target to score hits. Shooting at small points like lifeboats or bridges meant many rounds splashed harmlessly into the sea. The P-38 concentrated all its fire into a single line. Pilots could rake a ship from bow to stern, walking their fire down the center. They aimed at bridges, killing officers and helmsmen. They targeted engine spaces and anti-aircraft positions. The process was methodical and mechanical. A pilot would make a firing pass, pull up, circle, and attack again. The nose guns kept working. The complex feed systems that critics had doubted performed reliably in the cool air of the dive. The cannon, often criticized as temperamental, fired with a steady, pounding rhythm. Claims that the recoil would tear the aircraft apart faded with every wreck left burning on the water. The nose structure held firm. One pilot later described slicing a Japanese landing barge in half. The wooden craft carried about 50 soldiers. He fired for 2 seconds. The combined weight and force of cannon shells and machine gun rounds acted like a powered saw. The barge split down the middle, dumping men and wreckage into the sea. The fight had turned into methodical destruction. When the P-38s finally turned back toward base with their ammunition counters near zero, the scene below looked apocalyptic. Oil slicks spread across the Bismarck Sea. Ships burned or lay shattered, and debris floated everywhere. The convoy had been wiped out. All 8 transports were gone, along with 4 destroyers. Thousands of Japanese troops had died. American losses were minimal by comparison. The pilots flew back to their airstrips in New Guinea, arms sore from handling the heavy controls, ears ringing from engine noise, yet filled with a fierce satisfaction. They had met a major Japanese force and broken it. The P-38 had proven it was not an awkward novelty. It was a hunter. When they landed, ground crews rushed out. Eyes went immediately to the noses of the aircraft. Paint had bubbled from the heat of the gun barrels. Canvas covers were torn. Soot from the cannon stained the front of the central pod. Yet the airplanes were whole. Nothing had shaken loose or failed. Pilots climbed out, drenched in sweat and exhausted, and began telling stories that quickly spread. They spoke of wings being cut off bombers. They described Zeros exploding from shots fired at extreme range. They talked about the buzzsaw effect. Doubt faded. In its place grew a hard respect for the machine. Officials far from the front could continue debating convergence and firing patterns. The men fighting in the Pacific already understood. When immediate destruction was required, the P-38 delivered it. As engines wound down on the New Guinea airfields, the sudden quiet felt heavy. Pilots climbed from their cockpits, flight suits soaked, legs unsteady after hours of wrestling a heavy fighter through the sky. They walked to the front of their aircraft to look things over. The noses of the Lightnings were black with residue from thousands of fired rounds. Paint on the gun barrels had blistered and peeled. Mechanics did not see this as damage to worry about. They saw proof of performance. They ran hands across the tight gun openings that critics had once dismissed. Every stain of powder marked an enemy aircraft that would not return. The aircraft's vindication came not only from reports. It showed in the tallies. As the Pacific War continued, a new style of ace appeared. These men were not wild duelists relying on instinct alone. They were methodical. They understood the Lightning was a fast-moving gun platform. They used its speed to control when and how to fight, and its nose-mounted weapons to end engagements quickly. The strongest evidence for the design came from two names, Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire. They became the top two American aces of the war, both flying P-38s. Richard Bong, a quiet farm boy from Wisconsin who looked more like a newspaper carrier than a fighter pilot, achieved 40 confirmed victories. He did not earn them through turning contests with zeros. He used the Lightning's speed to ambush opponents and the concentrated nose guns to destroy them before they could respond. He often closed to short range, sometimes flying through debris from his targets, confident that when he fired, he would hit. Tommy Maguire was different in personality. He was intense, analytical, and focused on the rules of air combat. He even wrote a manual on using the P-38 in battle. He emphasized the importance of the nose-mounted guns. He told new pilots to forget traditional ideas about wide deflection shots and spraying fire. To him, the Lightning was a precision instrument. He finished the war with 38 victories, just behind Bong. Together, they demonstrated that critics who had dismissed the nose armament were mistaken. They proved that in the strict arithmetic of aerial combat, concentrating the greatest force into the smallest area was decisive. By 1944, the P-38 was no longer seen as an odd design. It had become the fork-tailed devil, a name that carried fear among Japanese forces. It performed a wide range of missions. It shot down bombers, strafed ships, and carried bombs to attack bridges. It even served as a night fighter, equipped with radar gear on its nose. An aircraft once rejected by the British and doubted by many American officers had become one of the most versatile and effective machines in the Pacific. Yet the end of the war brought an unexpected shift for the Lightning. Aviation technology was advancing rapidly. Even as P-38s secured air superiority over places like the Philippines, jet fighters were beginning to appear over Europe. The arrival of jet propulsion changed air combat fundamentally. Propeller-driven fighters, no matter how capable, were suddenly facing the limits of their era. The P-38, with its complicated twin-engine setup and large, heavy frame, suddenly belonged to another time. It represented the peak of piston engine design, but that chapter was closing. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the United States was left with thousands of surplus aircraft scattered across Pacific bases. Shipping them all back was too costly. The military made a hard, practical decision. Radios and guns were removed from the P-38s, fuel and oil were drained, and heavy equipment was brought in. For anyone who loves aviation, the images are painful to picture. Bulldozers shoved nearly new Lightnings into huge piles. These were aircraft that had helped win the war. Some had only logged a handful of flight hours. They were pushed into pits and crushed. Others were burned. Many were rolled off carrier decks and dumped into the ocean. The fork-tailed devils that had once terrorized enemy forces became scrap or artificial reefs. Pilots who had trusted these machines with their lives watched them treated like waste. Very few survived. Today, fewer than a dozen P-38s are still airworthy. Standing in front of one at a museum, you immediately notice its size. It towers above you, a twin-boom giant from a past era. Walk around to the nose, and Kelly Johnson's insight is still obvious. You see the four openings for the .50 caliber guns and the central port for the 20mm cannon. They are packed tightly together. You can almost imagine the vibration, the noise, and the violence that erupted from that small area when the trigger was pressed. The Lightning's legacy is not limited to the victory totals of Bong and Maguire. It also lies in the lesson it taught military designers. The debate over wing-mounted guns versus nose-mounted armament was effectively settled. When jet fighters came along, designers stopped placing guns in the wings. Aircraft such as the F-86 Sabre, the F-4 Phantom, and the F-15 Eagle carried their guns along the center line in the nose or fuselage. They followed the principle Kelly Johnson had proven. In close combat, a focused stream of fire is better than a scattered pattern. The P-38 showed that bold ideas can look strange to those tied to older methods. It demonstrated that unusual designs are often answers to problems others have not solved. Many experts saw the nose cluster and imagined a cramped maintenance nightmare. Pilots saw a tool that increased their chances of survival. They saw a weapon that reduced uncertainty. In a war where a fraction of a second could mean life or death, the lightning gave them a decisive advantage. These stories are preserved so that the fork-tailed devil and the men who flew it are not lost to time. They remind us that the tools that bring victory are often created in the face of skepticism. They also honor people like Richard Bong, who survived 40 aerial victories only to lose his life testing a new jet fighter before the war had fully ended. These aviators pushed limits until those limits broke. If this account of the buzzsaw and the aircraft that tore through enemy air power left an impression, consider supporting the channel with a like. Each one helps more people discover these histories. Subscribe and enable notifications so you do not miss future deep dives into the machines and individuals that shaped the war. New stories from the archives are explored every week.